In the picturesque town of Windhaven, Massachusetts, a place where everyone knows each other and secrets rarely stay buried, a story unfolded that no one could have anticipated. It all began on a bright spring afternoon in 2015, at the annual charity event to raise funds for the town's elementary school library. The sun shone down on the cobblestone square as families mingled, laughter echoed, and the smell of fresh pastries filled the air. Among the crowd was Emily Lawson, a beloved third-grade teacher. With her warm smile and kind heart, Emily was the pride of Windhaven. Her life was simple and fulfilling, dedicated to her students and her family. Little did she know that today would change everything. It was at this event that she met Ethan Whitmore, a wealthy and charming businessman who had recently returned to town. Ethan stood out effortlessly in his tailored suit, his confident demeanor drawing attention wherever he went. He wasn't just any man, he was the epitome of success and sophistication. When he approached Emily to compliment her dedication to the community, her cheeks flushed with a mix of surprise and excitement. Ethan seemed perfect, too perfect. Unbeknownst to Emily, there was another woman in Windhaven who had caught Ethan's attention. Sophie Chambers had recently moved to the outskirts of town, seeking solace after a troubled past. Sophie was intelligent, enigmatic, and driven, but beneath her composed exterior lay years of instability and loneliness. When Sophie met Ethan during a business consultation for his company, she found herself drawn to him in ways she couldn't resist. Ethan, always one step ahead, saw an opportunity. To the world, he was the ideal partner for Emily, a man ready to settle down with the town's sweetheart. But in private, he pursued a passionate and secret affair with Sophie, fueling her hope that she was the one he truly cared for. In truth, Ethan wasn't driven by love. He was a master manipulator who thrived on control, and both women became pieces in his elaborate game. As the weeks passed, Emily fell head over heels for Ethan. He swept her off her feet with grand gestures, dinners at upscale restaurants in Boston, surprise weekend getaways, and thoughtful gifts that made her feel like the center of his universe. Her parents, Thomas and Margaret Lawson, adored Ethan, seeing him as the perfect addition to their close-knit family. For Emily, he seemed like a dream come true. Meanwhile, Sophie found herself caught in a dangerous spiral. She believed every promise Ethan whispered during their stolen moments, clinging to the idea that he would eventually leave Emily for her. Sophie's past had left her with a deep fear of abandonment, and Ethan exploited this weakness masterfully. Her home, once a place of refuge, became a shrine to her obsession. She kept pictures of Ethan, scribbled notes about their future, and even began tracking Emily's daily routine. The tension in the story escalated one summer evening. At a local community gathering, Sophie spotted Ethan and Emily together. They were laughing, holding hands, and surrounded by friends and family. Sophie's heart sank as she realized how deeply embedded Ethan was in Emily's life. It was a stark reminder that she was merely a secret, a hidden chapter in Ethan's polished narrative. But things took an even darker turn when Sophie discovered a shocking secret. While going through some old paperwork from her foster care days, she stumbled upon documents revealing that Emily and she shared the same mother. They were half-sisters. This revelation sent Sophie into a tailspin. Her jealousy was now intertwined with guilt, yet the pain of being overlooked by both her mother and Ethan drove her deeper into despair. Ethan, oblivious to the connection between the two women, continued to juggle his double life. To Emily, he was the doting boyfriend who attended church with her family and made plans for their future. To Sophie, he was the forbidden lover who kept her on edge with vague promises. He thought he had everything under control, but the cracks in his facade were beginning to show. The stage was set for a collision course that would shatter the lives of everyone involved. As the summer turned to fall, the vibrant leaves of Windhaven began to mirror the fiery emotions brewing beneath the surface. Secrets were inching closer to exposure, and the perfect image Ethan had crafted was about to crumble. In Windhaven, the truth doesn't stay buried for long. And for Ethan Whitmore, Emily Lawson, and Sophie Chambers, the lies they lived would soon catch up with them, with consequences more devastating than they could ever imagine. The story was just beginning. The small town of Windhaven had always prided itself on its close-knit community, but behind the white picket fences and cobblestone streets, a storm was brewing. By the summer of 2015, Emily Lawson and Ethan Whitmore had become the talk of the town. Their relationship was straight out of a fairy tale. Emily, the sweet and devoted teacher, seemed to have found her Prince Charming in Ethan, the wealthy and sophisticated businessman. Ethan was the perfect boyfriend. He attended community events by Emily's side, charmed her family at Sunday dinners, and joined her at church every week. To anyone watching, he was the embodiment of commitment and devotion. Emily was overjoyed, blissfully unaware of the dark secrets that would soon unravel. But not everyone shared her happiness. Sophie Chambers, the woman Ethan had seduced in secret, was spiraling. She had watched from the shadows as Ethan and Emily's relationship blossomed. Each time she saw them together, her feelings of betrayal and jealousy deepened. Sophie couldn't understand why Ethan was playing this cruel game, stringing her along while building a life with Emily. At first, Sophie tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was waiting for the right moment to leave Emily. Maybe he needed her patience. But as the weeks turned into months, Sophie's hope began to waver. The sight of Ethan slipping a diamond ring onto Emily's finger at a summer barbecue shattered whatever illusions she had left. The announcement of their engagement sent shockwaves through Windhaven, and through Sophie's heart. The engagement marked a turning point for Sophie. Unable to process her emotions, she became obsessed with understanding Emily. She started following her, watching her from a distance as she went to work at the elementary school or strolled through the town square. Sophie even began attending the same church services, sitting a few pews back, watching Emily and Ethan pretend to be the perfect couple. Emily, with her kind heart and trusting nature, had no idea what was brewing. She even invited Sophie to join her and a group of friends for coffee after church one Sunday. To Sophie, the invitation was a bitter irony. Here was the woman who had everything Sophie had ever wanted, now offering her friendship as though it were some kind of consolation prize. But Sophie didn't reject the offer. She accepted, using it as an opportunity to get closer to Emily, and to Ethan. Over the next few weeks, she became a quiet fixture in Emily's social circle, always polite, always careful to mask her true feelings. The closer she got, the more she resented Emily's seemingly perfect life. Sophie began keeping a journal, scribbling down details about Emily's routine, her mannerisms, even her favorite coffee order. What started as curiosity morphed into something far darker. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself struggling to maintain control. Balancing two relationships was becoming increasingly difficult, especially as Sophie's behavior grew more unpredictable. She began texting him at odd hours, demanding explanations, threatening to expose their affair if he didn't leave Emily. Ethan, ever the manipulator, managed to calm her with empty promises. But deep down, he knew Sophie was becoming a liability. The cracks in Ethan's facade began to show. At a town gala in early fall, Emily caught him staring off into the distance, his usually charming smile replaced with a tense expression. When she asked if everything was all right, he brushed it off, blaming work stress. But for the first time, Emily felt a twinge of doubt. It was fleeting, quickly buried beneath her faith in Ethan's character, but it was there. For Sophie, the tipping point came when she stumbled upon an old box of documents from her foster care days. Among the papers, she discovered a detail that turned her world upside down: she and Emily shared the same mother. They were half-sisters. The revelation was devastating. Sophie now saw Emily not just as a romantic rival, but as someone who had taken the life and family she had always longed for. Conflicted and tormented, Sophie spiraled further. Her journal became a place for her darkest thoughts, as she vacillated between guilt and jealousy. She wondered if her mother had ever loved her. Did Emily even know about their connection? The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. Her feelings for Ethan twisted into something toxic, fueled by the belief that she deserved him, and the life he was building with Emily. As the vibrant colors of fall leaves blanketed Windhaven, the tension between the three of them reached a boiling point. Ethan believed he could keep his lies buried, Emily continued planning her dream wedding, and Sophie, consumed by rage and despair, began formulating a plan that would change everything. The storm that had been brewing was about to strike, and no one in Windhaven would escape unscathed. December 2016 in Windhaven, Massachusetts, was the picture of a winter wonderland. The streets were lined with twinkling lights, the scent of pine hung in the air, and snow blanketed the ground. It was the kind of setting that seemed to promise hope and happiness. For Emily Lawson, it was supposed to be the happiest month of her life. She was days away from marrying Ethan Whitmore, the man she believed was her soulmate. Emily's excitement was infectious. Her family and friends rallied around her, helping with the final touches for the ceremony at St. Matthew's Church. Windhaven buzzed with anticipation. It wasn't every day the town witnessed a wedding as grand as this. Emily's white gown hung in her childhood bedroom, a vision of elegance and purity. She couldn't wait to walk down the aisle and begin her new life as Mrs. Whitmore. But not everyone shared her joy. Sophie Chambers sat alone in her dimly lit house, the only sound the scribbling of her pen against paper. Her journal, once a place for fleeting thoughts, had become a manifesto of her unraveling mind. Page after page was filled with angry, desperate words about Ethan and Emily. The revelation that Emily was her half-sister had festered in her mind, twisting her jealousy into something more sinister. Sophie felt betrayed not just by Ethan, but by life itself. As the wedding day approached, Sophie's fragile mental state reached a breaking point. She had watched from the shadows as Emily and Ethan's relationship flourished, each moment a knife to her heart. The wedding was the ultimate betrayal. In Sophie's mind, it wasn't just a ceremony, it was a declaration that she would forever be the forgotten one, the outcast. She couldn't allow it to happen. The morning of the wedding dawned cold and crisp, the snow glittering under the pale winter sun. Inside the church, candles flickered against the stained glass windows as guests filled the pews. Emily stood at the back, her arm linked with her father's, a radiant smile lighting up her face. She didn't notice the shadowy figure lurking outside, hidden behind a snow-covered tree. Sophie had come to watch. Hidden from view, she could hear every word of the vows exchanged inside the church. Each promise of love and devotion drove her deeper into despair. When the church bells rang out to celebrate the union of Ethan and Emily, something inside Sophie snapped. The reception was a lavish affair, held at a historic estate on the edge of town. Guests danced and laughed, toasting to the happy couple. Ethan played his part perfectly, charming everyone with his warmth and wit. But every so often, his gaze would drift into the distance, his jaw tightening as if weighed down by an invisible burden. Emily, oblivious to the storm brewing around her, basked in the glow of the evening. She danced with her father, shared heartfelt moments with friends, and laughed as Ethan twirled her across the dance floor. It was everything she had dreamed of. But outside, Sophie was already putting her plan into motion. The next morning, as dawn broke over Windhaven, Emily laced up her running shoes for her usual jog. The air was biting, the streets silent save for the crunch of snow beneath her feet. She wore her favorite yellow running jacket, a bright beacon against the gray winter landscape. It was a route she had taken countless times before, one she thought she knew like the back of her hand. But she didn't know Sophie was waiting. Sitting in a car parked at the end of a secluded stretch of road, Sophie gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. Her breaths came in short, uneven gasps as she rehearsed what she was about to do. She had convinced herself that this was the only way. If Emily were gone, Ethan would finally be free, free to love her, free to build the life she deserved. When Emily came into view through the early morning mist, Sophie's heart pounded so loudly she thought it might burst. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, then started the engine. The sound shattered the morning stillness. The next moments passed in a blur of screeching tires, a muffled scream, and the sickening thud of impact. Emily's body crumpled to the ground, her yellow jacket stark against the snow. Sophie, operating on autopilot, drove away without looking back. Her mind raced with a mixture of relief and terror. She had done it. Emily was gone. It was a jogger who found Emily's body an hour later. By then, it was too late. Despite the best efforts of paramedics, Emily was pronounced dead at the scene. The news spread through Windhaven like wildfire, plunging the town into shock and grief. Ethan's performance as a grieving husband was flawless. At Emily's funeral, he wept openly, leaning heavily on her family for support. To the outside world, he was a man devastated by loss. But behind closed doors, the cracks in his facade began to show. For Sophie, the aftermath was not what she had imagined. Instead of feeling closer to Ethan, she felt more isolated than ever. Guilt gnawed at her, and every news report about Emily's death felt like a dagger to her heart. She had achieved her goal, but at what cost? As the snow fell softly over Windhaven, the town mourned the loss of one of its brightest lights. But the real story was only just beginning. The lies, the betrayal, and the secrets surrounding Emily's death were about to unravel, and the truth would prove more devastating than anyone could imagine. The tragedy of Emily Lawson's death sent shockwaves through Windhaven. The tight-knit town, still reeling from the loss of one of its most beloved residents, tried to piece together how such a horrific accident could have happened. The initial reports labeled it a hit-and-run, a random act of recklessness. But to Detective Rachel Cross, something about the case didn't sit right. Rachel, a seasoned investigator with a sharp eye for detail, arrived in Windhaven a few days after the incident. Snow still blanketed the streets, but the warmth of the holiday season had been replaced by an air of grief and suspicion. At the crash site, Rachel noted the inconsistencies. The tire marks on the icy road suggested deliberate acceleration rather than a panicked swerve. Witnesses reported hearing the screech of tires but no horn, an odd omission for a driver trying to avoid a pedestrian. To Rachel, these clues whispered one word: intent. Her investigation began with interviews. Emily's friends and family painted a picture of a woman who was kind, driven, and deeply loved by her community. But there were cracks in the surface, subtle comments about tension in her marriage. When Rachel pressed further, she learned that Emily had expressed concerns about Ethan's behavior in the weeks leading up to her death. He had become distant, distracted, and often seemed preoccupied. Emily's best friend recalled one particularly chilling comment: "Sometimes I feel like Ethan is hiding something from me." Ethan Whitmore, however, played his role as the grieving widower flawlessly. He met Rachel in his spacious office in Boston, his face a mask of sorrow. He spoke at length about how much he loved Emily, how her death had left a void in his life. But Rachel couldn't ignore the way his eyes flicked toward the door when she asked about their relationship, or the slight pause before he answered questions about Emily's final days. Meanwhile, Sophie Chambers was struggling to maintain her composure. In the aftermath of Emily's death, Sophie had expected relief, maybe even a sense of accomplishment. Instead, she was plagued by guilt. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Emily's bright yellow jacket crumpled in the snow. She avoided the news, but the headlines found her anyway: beloved teacher's tragic end, community mourns loss of a bright light. Her anxiety only deepened when Rachel knocked on her door. Sophie answered with a nervous smile, her hands trembling behind her back. Rachel asked a series of standard questions about Sophie's whereabouts on the morning of Emily's death. Sophie recited the alibi she had practiced, insisting she was home alone, catching up on work. Rachel seemed satisfied, but as she left, Sophie felt the weight of the detective's gaze lingering on her. The turning point in the investigation came when Rachel received an anonymous tip. A local jogger reported seeing a dark sedan parked near the crash site on the morning of Emily's death. The description matched Sophie's car. When Rachel followed up on the lead, she discovered that Sophie had recently taken her vehicle to a mechanic for front-end repairs. The damage, Sophie claimed, was from hitting a deer, but the mechanic's notes told a different story. The damage was consistent with a collision involving a person. Rachel's focus shifted to Sophie. A deeper dive into her background revealed a history of instability, as well as her connection to Ethan. Bank records showed multiple unexplained transfers from Ethan's account to Sophie's consulting business, raising red flags. When Rachel confronted Ethan with this information, his calm demeanor cracked. He denied any wrongdoing, but his protests felt hollow. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something big. Back in her dimly lit home, Sophie's world was unraveling. She had thought she could live with what she'd done, but the weight of her guilt was crushing her. She started avoiding Ethan's calls, terrified that he would demand more of her, that he would use her as a scapegoat to protect himself. One evening, as she flipped through her journal, she realized how far she had fallen. The pages were filled with dark thoughts, frantic scribbles about Emily, and plans she now regretted with every fiber of her being. Sophie wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. Ethan began to sense that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. He tried to reach out to Sophie, but she was slipping further from his grasp. He knew that if she broke, everything he had worked to build would come crashing down. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt powerless. Rachel's investigation reached a boiling point when Madison Porter, a former employee of Ethan's, came forward with damning evidence. Madison revealed that she had overheard Ethan and Sophie arguing in his office weeks before Emily's death. She had even recorded part of their conversation. In the recording, Ethan's voice was cold and calculating as he told Sophie, "Handle it. I don't care how, just make sure she's out of the way." The evidence was enough for Rachel to obtain a warrant to search Sophie's home. What she found confirmed her suspicions. Sophie's journal, filled with detailed notes about Emily's routines and the day of the crash, painted a chilling picture. Sophie was brought in for questioning, and under the weight of Rachel's relentless pursuit, she broke down. Through tears, she confessed to everything: the planning, the execution, and the overwhelming guilt that had consumed her ever since. As the snow continued to fall over Windhaven, the town learned the truth behind Emily's death. But the story wasn't over yet. Sophie's confession implicated Ethan as the mastermind behind it all, and Rachel was determined to hold him accountable. The investigation had pulled back the curtain on a web of lies, manipulation, and betrayal. The stage was set for a final reckoning, and Windhaven would never be the same. The confession of Sophie Chambers sent shockwaves through Windhaven, but Detective Rachel Cross knew the case was far from over. Sophie had admitted to being the driver in the hit-and-run that killed Emily Lawson, but there was one glaring question left unanswered: why? As Rachel pieced together Sophie's erratic journal entries and frantic testimony, one name kept coming up: Ethan Whitmore. Sophie's words lingered in Rachel's mind: "He told me to handle it. He said she was in the way." Sophie claimed Ethan had manipulated her into believing that Emily's death was the only way they could be together. Rachel, already suspicious of Ethan's carefully polished facade, now had enough evidence to confront him. Rachel arrived at Ethan's Boston office late one evening, her footsteps echoing in the sterile marble hallway. Ethan greeted her with his usual charm, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. He invited her to sit, offering coffee as if they were old friends. But Rachel didn't have time for pleasantries. "We need to talk about Sophie Chambers," Rachel began, her tone sharp. Ethan froze for a fraction of a second before leaning back in his chair, feigning nonchalance. "I'm not sure what you mean," he replied smoothly. Rachel leaned forward, her gaze unyielding. "She confessed, Ethan. She told us everything: how you encouraged her, how you made her believe Emily needed to be out of the way. Do you want to explain that?" Ethan's mask of composure cracked ever so slightly. "Detective, Sophie has always been unstable. You can't possibly believe her over me." But Rachel wasn't buying it. She slid a recorder across the desk, hitting play. The audio of Ethan's voice filled the room. "Handle it. I don't care how, just make sure she's out of the way." The color drained from Ethan's face. For the first time, he was cornered. Instead of denying it, Ethan shifted tactics. His tone became icy, calculated. "Do you really think you can pin this on me?" Sophie acted alone. "I had nothing to do with her decisions." Rachel stared at him, disgusted. "You manipulated her, Ethan. You exploited her vulnerability and pushed her to do something unforgivable. You might not have been behind the wheel, but you're as guilty as she is." Ethan's confidence faltered as Rachel's words struck home. He rose from his chair, pacing the office, his mind racing for a way out. But there was none. Rachel had what she needed to implicate him, and he knew it. Meanwhile, Sophie, now in custody, was unraveling further. The guilt of what she had done, combined with Ethan's betrayal, was more than she could bear. When Rachel visited her for a final interview, Sophie's eyes were hollow, her voice trembling. "I thought he loved me," she whispered. "I thought, if I did what he wanted, we could finally be happy. But he never cared. He used me." Rachel's heart ached at Sophie's words. As much as she despised what Sophie had done, she saw her as another victim of Ethan's cold, manipulative nature. Back in Windhaven, the community struggled to come to terms with the revelations. Emily's family, once supportive of Ethan, now viewed him with contempt. Margaret Lawson, Emily's mother, spoke out publicly, calling for justice. "He destroyed our family," she said through tears. "He took everything from us." The final blow came when Madison Porter, Ethan's former employee, handed over more evidence to Rachel. Madison had found financial records proving Ethan had funneled money to Sophie's consulting business, payments disguised as legitimate transactions but clearly meant to keep her quiet. The paper trail was damning. Ethan's world collapsed around him. The community that once admired him turned their backs. His reputation, carefully built over years, was reduced to ashes. Facing charges of conspiracy and financial fraud, Ethan was arrested at his Boston office. Cameras captured the moment, his once pristine image shattered for all to see. As Ethan sat in a holding cell, his thoughts raced. He had always believed himself untouchable, smarter than everyone around him. But now, stripped of his power and influence, he was just another criminal awaiting judgment. Sophie, too, awaited her fate. Though she had cooperated with the investigation, her role in Emily's death couldn't be overlooked. She expressed remorse during every interrogation, but the weight of her actions was undeniable. For Detective Rachel Cross, the case was a bittersweet victory. She had uncovered the truth, but it came at a cost. Windhaven would never be the same. The idyllic facade of the town had been ripped away, revealing the dark undercurrents beneath. At Emily's memorial service, the town gathered to honor her memory. A plaque was placed in the new library she had worked so hard to support, a reminder of the light she brought to the community. As the snow fell gently outside, Margaret Lawson placed a single yellow rose on the plaque, whispering, "We'll never forget you." The fallout from Emily's death left a scar on Windhaven, but it also brought a lesson: even in the quietest, most picturesque places, darkness can lurk. Lies, manipulation, and selfishness may thrive for a time, but the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. And for Ethan Whitmore and Sophie Chambers, their actions ensured they would never escape the weight of that truth. The trial of Ethan Whitmore was the event Windhaven never thought it would see. For months, the courtroom buzzed with tension as testimonies unraveled the calculated web of deceit Ethan had spun. Sophie Chambers had already pleaded guilty, her pale face and trembling hands a stark reminder of the consequences of misplaced trust and manipulation. But now, it was Ethan's turn to face justice. Emily Lawson's family sat in the front row, their grief etched into every line of their faces. Margaret Lawson, once a beacon of kindness, had become a warrior for her daughter's memory. Beside her, Thomas Lawson sat stoically, his jaw clenched as Ethan was led into the courtroom, shackles around his wrists. The once confident businessman now looked hollow, his tailored suits replaced by the drab uniform of an inmate. Detective Rachel Cross took the stand, her testimony meticulous and damning. She laid out the timeline, the manipulation, and the financial records that proved Ethan's role in orchestrating Emily's death. Madison Porter's recorded conversation played for the jury, Ethan's cold, calculated words echoing in the silent room, "Handle it. I don't care how, just make sure she's out of the way." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Ethan's expression was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of defeat. He knew the truth had finally caught up with him. Sophie Chambers, now visibly fragile, took the stand next. Her voice cracked as she recounted the months of manipulation, how Ethan had preyed on her vulnerabilities, promising her a future that was never real. She wept as she described the moment she realized the depth of his betrayal, the guilt of what she had done weighing heavier with every word. "I thought he loved me," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "But he used me, just like he used everyone." The Lawson family listened, their pain palpable. For Margaret, hearing Sophie's remorse was bittersweet. She despised what Sophie had done, but she couldn't ignore the broken woman standing before her. In Sophie, Margaret saw a tragic reminder of how far Ethan's cruelty had reached. The jury deliberated for hours, but the verdict was inevitable. Ethan was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and reckless endangerment. The judge's sentence was swift and unforgiving, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ethan stood motionless as the words echoed through the courtroom. For a man who had spent his life controlling others, the reality of losing his freedom was a punishment worse than death. As Ethan was led away, he locked eyes with Margaret Lawson. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might say something, an apology, perhaps, or a final attempt at justification. But no words came. Margaret's gaze was unflinching, a mother's silent fury burning into the man who had destroyed her family. For Sophie, the sentence was lighter, but the emotional burden was far greater. She received 25 years for her role in Emily's death, with the possibility of parole after 15. As she was escorted out, she turned to Margaret, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry." Margaret didn't respond. She couldn't. Forgiveness was a mountain she wasn't ready to climb. Months later, the town of Windhaven began to heal, though the scars of Emily's loss would never fully fade. The library she had worked so hard to fund was finally completed and renamed in her honor, the Emily Lawson Memorial Library. Inside, a plaque bore her name alongside the words, "In memory of a life dedicated to kindness and learning." At the library's grand opening, Margaret Lawson stood before the gathered crowd. Her voice trembled as she spoke. Emily believed in this town, in its people, and in the power of education. She saw the good in everyone, even when it wasn't easy. "I hope this library will stand as a reminder of her spirit, and as a lesson for all of us about the dangers of lies and manipulation." The crowd erupted in applause, but the mood was bittersweet. Windhaven had learned a hard lesson: even in the most idyllic places, darkness can thrive if left unchecked. One snowy evening, Margaret visited Emily's grave. She knelt by the headstone, placing a single yellow rose, the color Emily had always loved. "We're trying, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're trying to move on." Detective Rachel Cross watched from a distance. The case had taken its toll on her, too, but it had also reaffirmed her commitment to justice. As she walked back to her car, she thought about the people she had met during the investigation: Sophie, Madison, Margaret, and the choices that had led them all to this point. In her heart, Rachel hoped the truth would bring closure, but she knew the road to healing would be long. This story is more than just a tale of love and betrayal. It's a reminder of the power of manipulation and the devastating effects of unchecked ambition. It shows us how lies, no matter how carefully constructed, can never truly remain hidden. What do you think about Ethan's fate? Was justice served, or do you believe he deserved something more? And what about Sophie? Should her remorse earn her forgiveness? How does this story make you feel about trust and relationships in your own life? Let us know in the comments below. Your thoughts matter, and we'd love to hear how this story resonates with you.